There's a moment in every band's history where everything changes, where the sound crystallizes, the chemistry ignites, and the impossible suddenly becomes inevitable. For AC/DC, that moment happened in a cramped Sydney studio over 10 frantic days in November 1974, as 5 exhausted musicians stumbled in after midnight gigs to record what would become their debut album, High Voltage. This was rock and roll at its most raw, most desperate, most gloriously reckless. The story begins in November 1973, when Malcolm Young decided the rock world needed exactly what it didn't have anymore: a band that played loud, fast, and without apology. The early 70s had gone soft, drowning in mellow sounds and progressive excess. Malcolm and his younger brother Angus looked at each other with a simple understanding. They came from a musical family. Their older brother George had found fame with the easy beats, scoring an international hit with Friday on My Mind. But what Malcolm and Angus wanted was something harder, something that hit you in the chest like a hammer. They called their band AC/DC, that slash of electricity splitting the letters, powered by the voltage of pure rock and roll. At first they had a lineup that didn't quite work: bassist Larry Van Crete, drummer Colin Burgess, and a vocalist named Dave Evans, who the young brothers quickly realised was all wrong. Evans was too glam, too much like Gary Glitter when they needed someone who bled rock and roll from every pore. They recorded one single with Evans, Can I Sit Next to You Girl? But everyone knew it wasn't right. The voice was there, but the soul wasn't. Then came September 1974, and everything changed when Bon Scott walked into their world. Scott was an experienced vocalist, a friend of producer George Young, and a guy who'd been around the block a few times with bands like the Valentines and Fraternity. But more importantly, like the Young brothers, Bon had been born in Scotland before emigrating to Australia as a child. He understood the same musical language they spoke, rooted in Little Richard, Chuck Berry, and all those foundational rock and roll records that made you want to jump out of your skin. Angus later recalled that Bon moulded the character of AC/DC. Everything became more down to earth and straight ahead. That's when we became a band. The chemistry was immediate and undeniable. Bon didn't just sing the words, he lived them. His voice had that perfect rasp, that suggestion of danger and mischief, like he'd seen things he probably shouldn't tell you about, but might whisper in your ear after a few drinks. Where Dave Evans had been all sparkle and showmanship, Bon was grit and authenticity. The Young brothers knew they'd found their man. By November 1974, AC/DC was ready to record their debut album. They walked into Albert Studios in Sydney, a place that would become legendary in Australian rock history. It was a modest space, nothing glamorous, but it had something more valuable than expensive equipment. It had vibe. Angus would later say he wished he could have taken the walls with him when they left, because a guitar just came alive in that room. There was an energy, a raw electricity that you couldn't manufacture or buy. Running the sessions were George Young and Harry Vanda, known in the industry as Vanda and Young. These two had written the Easy Beats' biggest hits, including Friday on My Mind, and they understood how to capture lightning in a bottle. George was Malcolm and Angus's older brother, and when he first heard what his kid brothers were doing, he was genuinely impressed. As he told an interviewer years later, all of a sudden the Kid brothers were still the Kid brothers, but they knew how to play. There was no question of do they have it or don't they have it. It was obvious that they had something. The recording process was absolutely insane by today's standards. Angus later described it perfectly. It was actually recorded in 10 days in between gigs, working through the night after we came off stage and then through the day. I suppose it was fun at the time, but there was no thought put into it. Think about that for a moment. These guys would play a sweaty club gig, break down their equipment, drive to the studio and record until dawn. Then they'd sleep for a few hours and do it all over again. There was no luxury of endless takes, no obsessing over every note. They played it, captured it, and moved on. This frantic energy became the album's greatest strength. Every guitar riff carries the rawness of musicians too tired to second-guess themselves, too focused on the next gig to overthink. The rhythm section for these sessions wasn't the Phil Rudd and Mark Evans combination that would become iconic on later albums. Instead, bassist Rob Bailey and drummers Tony Correnti and Peter Clack held down the rhythm. George Young himself played bass on several tracks, including Stick Around, Love Song, and the title track High Voltage. Correnti, who played drums on most of the album, has been tragically overlooked by history. AC/DC biographer Jesse Fink lamented that Correnti's name doesn't appear on any of the album reissues, despite his crucial contribution. Malcolm and Angus traded lead guitar parts on Soul Stripper and Show Business, with Malcolm even taking the solo on Little Lover. This was a band still figuring out their roles, still discovering who they were. The album had traces of glam rock influence that they'd soon discard completely, but beneath it all, you could hear the foundation of the AC/DC sound being built brick by sonic brick. But nothing captures the beautiful chaos of those sessions quite like the Bagpipes story. When they were working on songs for what would become their second album, TNT, producer George Young had an idea for It's a Long Way to the Top, If You Want to Rock and Roll. The song was already powerful, a defiant anthem about the brutal reality of trying to make it in rock and roll. But George thought it needed something extra, something that would set it apart. That's when he remembered that Bon Scott had mentioned playing in a pipe band back in Scotland. When George suggested Bon play bagpipes on the track, Bon immediately said he could do it. What he conveniently forgot to mention was that while he had indeed played in a pipe band called the Coastal Scots in Fremantle with his father, he'd been the drummer, not a piper. This rather significant detail somehow slipped his mind until after he'd already committed to the idea. So Bon headed off to a music shop on Park Street in Sydney and returned with a set of Hardy bagpipes that cost $479 Australian dollars. To put that in perspective, bassist Mark Evans later mused that the amount would have bought 2 Stratocaster guitars. For a band still finding their way, still scraping by, this was a massive investment based on Bon's enthusiastic assurance that he totally knew what he was doing. The reality was considerably more complicated. First, they had to assemble the damn things. Watching the young brothers try to put together bagpipes was, by all accounts, comedy gold. Malcolm, Angus and George gathered around the pieces like they were trying to solve a particularly frustrating puzzle, with plenty of Scottish swearing thrown in for good measure. Eventually they got the instrument together, only to discover that Bon didn't actually know how to play it in the traditional sense. What Bon could play was the recorder, so he got creative. He played the melody on the chanter, the part of the bagpipes that makes the actual notes. Then they recorded the drones separately and layered everything together in the mix. Malcolm later explained, Bon actually could play flute, not bagpipes. So he got the chanter from the bagpipe and played the melody. Then we did the drone separate and put it on and it sounded fantastic. The result was genuinely unique, a hard rock song with bagpipes that somehow worked perfectly, capturing both the band's Scottish heritage and their defiant attitude. But playing bagpipes live became the bane of Bon Scott's existence. Former manager Michael Browning described it perfectly. I think they probably put more pressure on him than anything I can think of. They invariably never worked. It's a hard instrument to time to guitars because you're pumping them and they kind of kick in when the bag's full. Very difficult to time to guitars. The whole band had to tune to the bagpipes drone, and Bon would be sweating bullets trying to get enough air in the bag to make them work while maintaining his stage presence. They probably only played the song live about 30 times before abandoning the bagpipes entirely. The final straw came when Bon set the pipes down at the corner of a stage during a gig and fans destroyed them. After that, they either used a backing track or Angus extended his guitar solo in that section. The songs on High Voltage told stories that were raw and real. She's Got Balls was about Bon's ex-wife Irene, and it was the first song that Bon and the Young brothers wrote together. Right out of the gate, they established that Bon Scott would write lyrics that were provocative, honest, and unapologetically direct. Little Lover had an interesting history. Malcolm had been tinkering with the music since he was about 14, originally calling it Front Row Fantasies. When Bon added lyrics, he wrote about Angus, even name-checking glam rock star Gary Glitter in the song. It was a cheeky acknowledgement of the glam rock influence they were still shaking off, a sound that didn't quite fit who they were becoming. Baby Please Don't Go was a cover of the blues standard, but AC/DC's version crackled with electricity. They took this old song and supercharged it with their own raw energy. There was also Love Song O Jean, which was uncharacteristically maudlin for AC/DC. Some speculated the lyrics were left over from Bon's previous band Fraternity, a gentler moment on an album that otherwise hit you over the head, with power chords and attitude. The album cover itself was memorable and slightly outrageous. Chris Gilby from Albert Productions came up with the concept, an electricity substation with a dog relieving itself against it. As Gilby later explained, "It's so tame now, but back then we thought it was pretty revolutionary." The image perfectly captured the band's irreverent attitude, their willingness to thumb their nose at good taste in favour of something memorable and funny. When High Voltage was released in Australia on February 17, 1975, it climbed to number 7 on the charts. Not bad for a debut album, but the real story was what was happening on stages across Australia. AC/DC's live shows were becoming the stuff of legend. Angus would run around in his schoolboy uniform, the idea suggested by his sister Margaret, creating this bizarre contrast between his innocent costume and the dirty, powerful rock and roll they were playing. Bon would command the stage with his swagger and charisma, making every woman in the audience feel like he was singing directly to her, and every man feel like he'd found his new best friend. Then came the international release, and with it, one of rock history's most famously wrong reviews. When Atlantic Records decided to compile tracks from the first 2 Australian albums for international release in 1976, also titled High Voltage, they had no idea what kind of reaction they'd get. The international version only included 2 songs from the original Australian High Voltage, She's Got Balls and Little Lover. The rest came from their second Australian album TNT, which had been released in December 1975. Rolling Stone magazine assigned the review to Billy Altman, and his words would become infamous. Altman wrote, "Those concerned with the future of hard rock may take solace in knowing that with the release of the first US album by these Australian gross-out champions, the genre has unquestionably hit its all-time low." He described Bon Scott spitting out his vocals with truly annoying aggression, and concluded with, "Stupidity bothers me. Calculated stupidity offends me. AC/DC didn't care. They just kept playing, kept touring, kept building their following one converted fan at a time, and plenty of other musicians saw what Billy Altman couldn't." Years later, when Eddie Van Halen encountered AC/DC at the 1978 Day on the Green Festival in Oakland, California, he had a very different reaction. Eddie was sitting in Van Halen's trailer when he heard what he described as rubble pounding noise coming from the stage. He walked out to find 60,000 people bouncing up and down in unison to AC/DC's set. Eddie later recalled, "I was standing on the side of the stage thinking, we have to follow these guys. They were so powerful, but I remember feeling that we held our own. I was really happy. It blew my mind. I didn't think anybody could follow them." This from Eddie Van Halen, one of the most technically gifted guitarists in rock history, admitting that AC/DC's sheer power and simplicity was genuinely intimidating. Angus Young and Eddie would become friends, with Eddie even calling Angus at 2 a.m. once just to tell him he was a bad guy, in the best possible sense. Billboard magazine gave High Voltage a much more positive review than Rolling Stone, calling it a cross between Led Zeppelin and the sensational Alex Harvey Band. But it didn't matter what critics said. The album was connecting with fans who wanted rock and roll that was direct, honest, and powerful. They didn't want 10-minute progressive rock epics or mellow singer-songwriter confessionals. They wanted to feel that electricity, that high voltage running through their bodies. The album eventually went on to sell 3 million copies in the United States alone, achieving quadruple platinum status by 2024. It took years to get there. High Voltage didn't crack the Billboard 200 until 1981, long after Highway to Hell and Back in Black had made AC/DC superstars. But that slow burn was part of the story. They built their success the hard way, gig by gig, riff by riff, fan by fan. Looking back now, 50 years after those 10 frantic days in Albert Studios, High Voltage stands as proof that sometimes the best albums are the ones made without overthinking. There's a purity in those recordings, a captured moment of a band discovering themselves in real time. You can hear them figuring out who they are, what they sound like, how to channel all that raw energy into something recordable. The album has rough edges, moments where you can tell they're still finding their way. But those imperfections are part of its charm, evidence of real musicians in a real studio making real rock and roll without a net. The songs from High Voltage that made it onto the international release are still concert staples today. She's Got Balls and Little Lover may not be as famous as Back in Black or Highway to Hell, but they represent the foundation upon which everything else was built. They show a band willing to be raw, willing to be honest, willing to embrace the power of simplicity over complexity. George Young and Harry Vanda deserved enormous credit for knowing how to capture what made AC/DC special. They didn't try to polish the rough edges or make the band sound like anyone else. They understood that the power was in the rhythm, in the groove, in that undeniable feeling that made you want to move. As former manager Michael Browning said, George and Harry's most important criterion was rhythm. The whole thing had to just feel right. If you listen to those records today, they feel good. And that's the lasting legacy of High Voltage. It feels good. It makes you want to crank the volume, bang your head, feel that electricity coursing through you. Is rock and roll, played by guys who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is commit completely to the groove and not look back. From those 10 chaotic days in Sydney to worldwide recognition, from sleeping a few hours between gigs and studio sessions to selling out stadiums, from a dog relieving itself on an electric substation to inspiring generations of rock musicians, High Voltage was the spark that ignited everything. It proved that you didn't need endless studio time or massive budgets to create something that would last. You just needed 5 guys who knew how to play, a producer who understood what made them special, and the courage to capture it all before anyone could overthink it. The album's influence extends far beyond its commercial success. It established the template that AC/DC would follow for decades. Powerful riffs, driving rhythms, lyrics that spoke to the rock and roll lifestyle without pretension, and a sound that hit you in the gut. Every album they've made since has been built on the foundation laid in those 10 days in November 1974. So the next time you hear that opening riff, that driving beat, that unmistakable voice cutting through the mix, remember where it all started. Remember 5 exhausted musicians working through the night between gigs, a vocalist who claimed he could play bagpipes when he really couldn't, a producer who believed in the power of rhythm above all else, and a debut album that critics dismissed but fans embraced. Sometimes greatness comes from pure necessity, from having 10 days to capture magic before you have to get back on the road. 50 years later, High Voltage is still running through speakers around the world, still making people move, still proving that sometimes the simplest approach is the most powerful. If this deep dive into the creation of a rock and roll landmark resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe to keep exploring the stories behind the music that shaped our world. The riffs may be timeless, but the stories behind them are waiting to be told, and we're just getting started on this journey through rock history.